I remember in a history class after my service at the University of Kentucky, and a professor made the comment that since World War II, we haven't fought any legitimate or just wars. Mm-hmm. And even though I was against the Vietnam War totally by that point, I took some offense at that. And over the years, I find myself agreeing with that. Mm-hmm. In my mind, we haven't fought a just war since World War II. The other point that you made that I think also kind of bothers me and has bothered me for 5 decades is the comparative justice, notion of comparative justice, and not basically to cause more pain than the pain you're trying to stop. And I think modern war, especially in the electronic age, the statistics are very obvious that we're killing in Vietnam. I think the estimate is between 3 and 6 million civilians. The United States thinks 3 million. The Vietnamese say 6 million. I tend to trust that larger figure a little bit more, frankly. And 1 million to 1.5 million combatants. The statistics of the Mideast wars are very difficult to find, and they don't talk about them very much. But the little bit that I've heard, it seems to me that we're also killing more civilians than combatants. So, and I think I see us moving in a direction where we continue to electrify the battlefield, and in the case of drones and planes, and so we're now maybe 3,000, 5,000, 8,000 miles away from the battlefield, mm-hmm. and we're making decisions based on a television screen, and we're pushing buttons. I have a real hard time having faith that we can really discern combatants from civilians in many cases. And when you're that far away and you're in a nice sanitized little room, I think pushing that button becomes more of a game than combat. I think there's a lot of value, as ironic as it is to say, in facing somebody face to face and shooting them, mm-hmm. as opposed to, I think for me there's less moral damage, I think, mm-hmm. Than there could be sitting comfortably drinking Coke and dropping bombs on people. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the question is, frankly, other than the observation that the way wars are evolving, more and more civilians are going to pay the price.
I think that's true. I think that if you look at Revolutionary War or that time frame, when everybody was in rank and file, in uniform, take a knee so the row behind you can fire, that kind of thing. It's very obvious who the enemy is. It's very obvious who the enemy is not. And until guerrilla warfare kind of tactics became more prevalent, it's well known who's the enemy and who's not, who's the combatant, who's not. And it is increasingly difficult to manage that now. And that's intentionally. It's trying to hide who the enemy is. It's the enemy are doing that. And we do that when we're the enemy of the other guys. That's something to, everybody who goes to war is somebody else's enemy. Whether you're American or the others, you're the other person's enemy. So we try to deceive who is a combatant. They try to deceive who is a combatant because they don't want the combatants killed. They want to promote their own cause. So yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And what that results in is a greater degree of moral ambiguity, a greater degree for the individual in war to have a moral or a philosophical or spiritual injury as a result of the war, because you're not sure whether or not that war was just. You're not sure if that was a combatant or a non-combatant. You're not sure if what your government's telling you is accurate or not. And I'm not saying that against the United States government. I'm saying any government.
Yes.
Everybody is receiving their news from their government, however true or however false that news is. Whether they're totally deceiving their populace or whether they're totally honest, you're receiving news that is trying to cause a reaction among those that are following it. Many times that's propaganda, and many times it's factual. But whatever it is, that's what you're basing your decisions on, because you're not the eyes on the ground. You're not. I mean, well, eventually, maybe some people are, but there's a lot of moral ambiguity, and there's a lot of people who have pain for generations or decades after war because they really aren't sure if they did the right thing.
One last point from your initial presentation, if we can explore a little bit, and you just referenced it again, the distinction of an enemy. The fog of war is really, really thick, and I don't care who you are or how you've been trained, you're scared to death. So mistakes will be made.
Mm-hmm.
People will react too quickly. Holding your fire is more courageous than pulling that trigger in many, many situations.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
To me, that's moral courage. But my concern is that we compound that complexity, that chaos, with certain attitudes culturally instilled, I think, throughout our childhood, and really double down reinforced in military training. And that is the enemy is dehumanized.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the other in our culture, when I was raised in the 50s, 60s, I don't know that we disliked or feared or hated the other so much other than the commies.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that is a strong theme in our culture today, distrust of the other, especially the less we know, the more distrustful we are.
Mm-hmm.
The second layer to me of that is an attitude that was prevalent in Vietnam, and I know it is in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. And that's the idea is that anybody can be a murderer, even a 3-year-old child can kill you. Mm-hmm. And since they're not really human beings, you can rest assured that that 3-year-old child walking at you probably does have a mom under them. Mm-hmm. And so between the general dehumanization and the idea that in these kinds of wars, everyone basically is your enemy, I think result in a lot of atrocities.
Mm-hmm. And it's intentional. I mean, not the atrocities, mm-hmm. but the dehumanization is intentional. It's something that there's a book on killing by Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, and he talks about the evolution of the United States military and how they train their soldiers and how they, in previous wars, there was such a high percentage of rounds fired to the low percentage of people actually wounded or killed. And so we as a government, as a military, initiated ways to make that a closer ratio, that you have more injuries per round fired. And, one of those things that anybody who's been in the military, we don't shoot at round paper targets. When I was at basic training, I shot at little communists. We were shooting communists and name calling. We intentionally have names for the enemy that are demoralizing, and you, regardless of the conflict, or regardless of the people populace, we have a slur name for whoever it is. And that's to make them lesser than ourselves, so that we don't feel as bad about shooting someone, because they're not human. They're not our equals. They're lesser than. So it's intentional. It's very intentional. And then we don't do anything to ever resolve that. We don't ever take it back in any way. Once that person as well, or that group of people or that nation is no longer a threat, there's no mechanism to say, oh, well, they're human again.
Yes.
It doesn't exist. To my knowledge, it doesn't exist to my knowledge in any culture. So we get much more intensified dislike of the other because of that, and we're doing it within American political systems. Even the right and the left are becoming us against them rather than one nation with a common goal.
And the other side's being dehumanized in the process.
Exactly.
You know, they're this or they're that.
Yeah.
Kind of a related topic, and maybe this is just an observation, that we're not taught to respect other people generally from other cultures because we are the superior culture, blah, blah, blah. And so the attitude very often of military is that you don't really need to know anything about your enemy. We're just going to go in there and use our superior weapons and we're going to win this thing. And I think that most officers that I was familiar with during my service knew nothing about the Vietnamese. Never read anything about them, other than all they knew is they were commies, and ultimately they were gooks, which is even lower than a commie. But there were some officers. My father was one who spent months and months reading Vietnamese history before he went. And he had the utmost respect for the Vietnamese fighter, for our enemy, utmost respect, as most Americans who were in combat also came to feel the same way. And my contention is that a lack of respect, i.e. through dehumanization, these slur terms, causes lives on our side. Because you think, well, we'll just do this. They're gooks. You know, they're unsophisticated,
unable to do anything.
And so let's take this hill. And there are examples after examples in Vietnam of taking hills where we were slaughtered, and for no reason. And if we were able to take the hill, we held it for a couple hours, and then we left, and the enemy came right back. Absolutely no purpose to it.
I wouldn't be able to speak intelligently about it, but I would imagine that there are hundreds of examples of underestimating the enemy, resulting in negative consequences for our troops. I can't even imagine how many times that would be true.
And I don't know the curriculum at West Point, Annapolis any longer, but my hope is, and I know that some of the modules they've developed do deal with some of these complexities, but my hope is that they emphasize, respect your enemies. It may save your life or the lives of people you're leading.
Yeah, knowledge is power. If you know your enemy, you can better meet that challenge. I think.
To ignore 2,000 years of the Vietnamese fighting off the Chinese, it was really, really naive and negligent. And
that's true in Afghanistan right now. I mean, it's the same situation.
So as much as I'd love to spend several hours just talking about your first set of observations, let me ask you to kind of go to another thing you mentioned up front, conscientious objector status, and you have some other categories that you introduced me to just shortly ago. So would you mind to just kind of talk about, that general idea of conscientious objection?
So conscientious objector, or just the term conscientious itself, is reflective of one's own conscience. What do I believe about myself? What do I believe about my conscience? And what can I do according to that conscience? So a conscientious objector says, I don't believe that I can participate in war or the war effort. That because of my personal faith, but my personal beliefs, my personal history, I cannot participate in war. Or possibly what they would say is I cannot participate in this war, whatever this war is. If you're a just war theorist and it's not a just war by your definition, and I will say by your definition, because lots of these can be, whether it's a just cause is subjective and can be debated. But if it's not a just war in my perspective, then I can't participate in that war. And then there's some that would say I cannot participate in war, period. So that's because of my conscience, I object to the war, I'm not going to participate. Or I object to this war, I'm not going to participate. That's conscientious objector. A second category is a conscientious participant, which means I believe that war is wrong. I believe this war is wrong, but I believe that the cause might be right. And so I'm willing to support the war effort, but I'm not willing to participate fully. I'm not willing to take up arms against the enemy, but I might serve as a medic, or I might serve in some other capacity. When I was deployed myself personally, I was working with space-based operations, and my commander approached me and he said, Joe, there's things here that I want to check out with you and make sure that this is something you can do. I don't want to put you in this position to do this job, because he knew I was in seminary. I was training to be a chaplain, and he said, I just want to check before I have you doing this job that you're okay with this. A lot of commanders won't do that. A lot of commanders will assume you're the government's man, you're going to do what the government wants, kind of thing. But this commander wanted to check if I had any conscientious objections to the particular work I was doing, which I think is a great example of leadership. And I didn't have any objections to the kind of work I was doing, and continue to do it. But a conscientious participant would be someone who is willing to participate in war, but not willing to take life, or not willing to, he'll draw a line, he or she will draw a line somewhere saying, this is what I'm willing to do, this is what I'm not. So maybe that's only that they'll provide water, or they'll, do something. But it's a smaller category. The most famous conscientious participant that I can think of that's been in the world of movies recently is Desmond Doss, the medic, and I can't think of the name of that movie, but Desmond Doss was willing to be in the armed forces, but he wasn't willing to use a weapon against people. So that's a conscientious participant. And then you have a full participant, somebody who says, well, for God and for country, or for God or for country, or whatever their motivation is, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get this job done. And that's a full participant. So those are the categories of people I would suggest are part of this just war discussion. Right?
Yeah. CO status for short. CO status was very difficult to get in the 60s. And even more difficult to get if you were already in the service.
Mm-hmm.
I have talked to people who were in the service
mm-hmm.
and were able to get CO status and get out. But CO status was perceived as cowardly.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people would think that.
And in as you mentioned, many cases, conscientious objectors chose to be medics. Mm-hmm. Feeling that they wouldn't have to actually kill anyone and they would be saving people. And and to think of a CO who says, I'll be a medic, or a participant, conscientious participant who says, I'll be a medic, and to think of them as cowardly is maybe the most naive thing I can think of.
You're still going into combat, but you're no mechanism of defense.
Lord. Yeah, that was the toughest job,
right.
And the job that has probably the most lingering impact on a person's life that I'm familiar with in military service.
And in many cases, that's the person deciding whether someone can be saved or not.
Yes.
So there's and whether they, you only got time to meet so many people. You've only got supplies for so many people, and you've got to triage and try to save the person that you think is most likely to be saved. And that it may be that your best friend is the person you want to work on, but he's not going to be able to be saved, and somebody else is a better candidate for receiving your care. So a lot of survivor's guilt, I imagine, with a great many medics.
Yes.
Yeah. And we, as we were discussing even before the interview started, is the idea of, the Hippocratic Oath states that you're helping whoever needs help. So that's not just the combatants from your side, but that's the combatants of the other side. It's saving the injured persons of the enemy, and maybe that's something that's a hard pill to swallow as well.
Yes. Yeah. I am thinking of Tim O'Brien, who is a Vietnam author, perhaps one of the best writers coming out of that war. And he was a talking head on Ken Burns's exceptional series on Vietnam, and he was in every episode discussing many of these issues. He wrote a book that was fairly popular for a short period of time called The Things They Carry. And one of the series of stories, and one of the stories is presumably about him as he debated whether he would respond to his draft call. And he was spending time, he'd gone to the north of the United States on the Canadian border, and he was debating whether he was going to cross that border or not. And for a couple of weeks, he stayed with an old man who ran a summer camp, which was closed at this point for the season, helped him around the camp. And they would go fishing, and the borders were separated by a river. And, in this particular story, he's talking about sitting in that boat halfway between the United States and Canada, and asking the old man to row him. And he thought he suspected the old man knew what was going through his head. And he was whether he would ask the old man to row him to Canada or stay in the boat and go back to the United States. In his last couple sentences, or paraphrasing a little bit, that he said, he thought about all the embarrassment his family would have if he went to Canada. That was his concern. And in the end, he said, I was a coward. I decided to go to Vietnam. And so it underscores for me a couple things. One is the moral courage to stand up for your principles, even in the face of embarrassment, family embarrassment, and perhaps ruining your career, perhaps even losing your country, which people went to Canada fully expecting never to be able to come back. So that is incredible courage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You talked about moral, spiritual, and you used another term, psychological, philosophical, I think, even injury. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely.
Those ideas?
Yeah. So all of those terms, moral injury, psychological injury, conscientious injury, those are all ideas of having betrayed who you think you are. And so when your government is asking you to do something and you are a true patriot and your faith says don't do that same thing, and you think that you are a devoted person of faith and a devoted patriot, and you have to pick between the two, that's a pretty big room for moral injury or spiritual injury. Like, who do I serve? Really, quite frankly, you're serving two masters. We think of that idea from Scripture. Jesus is talking about serving two masters as money or God, but in this instance, it's still two masters. It's government and God, and how do you serve them both well? Now, if you think that the old expression, every soldier that ever went to war thought God was on his side, that's an exaggeration, but all people of faith, when they go to war, assume that they are on God's side. Not all, but most. So if you can reconcile that, and that the nation is representing God, then there's not really much room for that, other than your personal beliefs. I don't think I should do this, but I'm honoring God, I'm honoring nation. But when you're honoring God or nation and violating the other one, then that's a bigger problem. That's a bigger room for error. But any of those injuries are injuries of who I think I am as compared to who I've proved myself to be, or who some of them are strictly theodicy. Like, how could God allow me? Theodicy being why God kind of questions. But it's how can a good God allow this to happen? Or how can an all-knowing God allow this to have happened? Or how can a loving God allow me to have done this to another person or whatever? So those spiritual injury, moral injury, those injuries of conscience are where someone has a conflict between who they are and who they thought they were, or who God is as compared to what they believed God was growing up. So they're having a crisis of faith or a crisis of identity. And they until there's equilibrium restored, until they understand who they are, or until they can offer themselves forgiveness or God forgiveness, then that's going to be something that they're going to continue to wrestle with.
So that's a very, very helpful clarification on those issues. We see those terms used more and more in literature. Invisible wounds is kind of the catch-all term that I've used many times. So that's the dilemma. And can you talk to us a little bit about the recovery from that dilemma?
Okay, sure. And in fact, that kind of goes back to something you asked at the beginning, is some of my work at the hospital. I work at the VA hospital in Lexington, and a lot of the people that that I'm talking with are discussing concerns about, a lot of people I know have stopped believing in God at Vietnam. That's a spiritual injury. That's somehow they have not reached equilibrium between the harm done and whom they thought God was. So part of the healing on that is better theology. Part of the healing on that is working with forgiveness. Part of the healing on that is working on and it couples with forgiveness, but it's working on that, reducing that us versus them. It's learning about that culture and understanding, I was wrong about my enemy. And it's, so you've either got to forgive enemy or self or God or country. So there's a lot of forgiveness work, and that's where Chaplain comes in. But part of that forgiveness work, some of the best work in building that forgiveness is not really a lot of it is readjusting your thoughts or that you're thinking about something, but it's actually doing works of reparation. It's going and having a meal with a Vietnamese family when they were your enemy. It's going back and restoring a village, building a village, or and in some cases you can't do that. You can't go back to Vietnam, or you can't go back to Korea, or you can't go back to Iraq, wherever your war is. Sometimes you can't go back there and fix something, literally fix something. Maybe the reparation is sending something there, sending care packages or sending stuffed animals to the kids, especially if whatever you did involved kids. The sin you committed in your mind was against kids. Then doing something for those kids. But even if it's not anything to do with the country that you once were in, there's still a restoration to be made. If say I felt responsible for destroying property and villages and that kind of stuff, well, then I can volunteer with Habitat for Humanity here and build for people that need it here, and that's still the same. The idea is as closely to the harm that you perceive yourself having done. The closer you can get to that same action in reverse is really the most therapeutic means of healing. So if you thought war itself was wrong and you become a peace activist, if you think that you destroyed somebody's water supply or their ability to cook or their home, and you can do any kind of reparation where you like Heifer International or something, you can send a cow to that country or send a water purification to that, whatever it is, and it may be to a different country, but it's restoring that balance of wrong, having done wrong and having done a justice.
Yes.
And going back to the Summa Theologica, those were sins against peace. So if you can do reparations towards peace in any capacity, then that sort of sets it at balance, and there's more healing that will take place. Plus, it's a lot of people lack meaning, lack purpose in their life, and that's in itself is a spiritual injury. So being able to do those kind of things are building spiritual strengths. It's when your cup is empty, that's filling it up, kind of thing. So it's doing meaningful work in the world that promotes peace.
Those are incredibly insightful comments. I advocated many years ago for a veteran Peace Corps, for lack of a better term, but in my mind, I envisioned Vietnam veterans going back and doing the things you talked about. And as it turns out, many did. And I've traveled pretty extensively in Vietnam in the last 20 years and have come across many veterans who live there. And they're all engaged in work for many of the reasons, probably all the reasons you mentioned. What's dismaying to me is that our government, going back to one of your earlier points, our government hasn't felt a sense of obligation. There are 1,500, 2,000 children and farmers that die every year from unexploded ordnances as they dig and play or dig to plant seeds. Agent Orange has saturated the ground in Vietnam and killed much of it. And that's a heck of a big price tag. In my mind, we're responsible for coming up with that money. Over the years, we've denied it. So it was the South Vietnamese military that sprayed the Agent Orange, which is totally a lie. And if they did, and when they did, it was under our direction, and we supplied it. So for me, there's that many veterans could benefit from those reconstructive, positive efforts if they are suffering from the destruction that they witnessed or participated in while they're there. And I hope and envision the same thing for Iraq and Afghanistan. I can see what it's done for people to go and build a clinic or school, water, or help dig up old bombs. So to me, that should be part of our national policy subsequent to a war, that you both have some obligation in helping that country recover, especially in the cases where we are responsible for the lingering effects. And I think it would be very helpful to veterans, and even veterans who wouldn't recognize that as a possibility, who were given the opportunity, might find that to be very healing unexpectedly. And I think of the one Marine that had moved to Vietnam and was working at an orphanage for Agent Orange deformed children. And he said, I went through every therapy the VA had for PTSD, and he said none of it worked. He said, I did everything, none of it worked. This has worked. So we ought to think in terms of recovery, that there will be soldiers that need
to go back.
Yeah.
That Ed Tick is a proponent of that. He's taken, I don't know how many soldiers back to Vietnam and have them meet Vietnamese families and eat with them. And he also does sweat lodges. There's lots of interesting healing rituals that can take place. But absolutely, so some people need to go back. And you mentioned the idea of the government's responsibility. If you and I were in a fight and one of us was harmed, we're not going to move past that till one of us admits we're wrong. And so that's that. We can't make reparations if we can't admit that we've done something wrong.
So I think it's more complex or made more complex because we didn't win.
Right.
It seems that we're considerably more generous if we have won with our enemy than we are when we have lost or it's a draw. So Vietnam, I don't know how people view it. It was a loss in my mind. It was lost because it could never have been won to begin with. But I don't know how Afghanistan and Iraq will be viewed later on, as a draw, perhaps as a defeat. Depends on what transpires between now and going into the future. For me, the win-loss thing shouldn't even be in the equation. We're responsible for this, and we have responsibility to help out. And that goes more to national healing. In my mind, we need national healing. Individual healing is obviously important, but it's much larger than that.
Yeah.
So we have to think about policies.
Yeah. If it's a nation at war, then it's a nation that needs to end.
Yes.
Mhm.
Chaplain Joe White, I can't tell you how much I'd like to continue this for hours and hours and hours. But I don't want to take up too much of your time. In this short time we've been together, there's so much information in here, so many ideas, so many things to consider personally, politically, and spiritually, that this can serve, I think, to nurture our minds and our souls for a long, long time. So I want to thank you particularly for your service in the VA.
Well, thank you. It's an honor.
And it's an absolute privilege and honor to have you join our class via Zoom or via taping.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Yeah.